was standing behind a black curtain with a headset looped around my neck when I heard a reporter ask the question that ended my old life. The press conference was packed past capacity, journalists shoulder to shoulder in a ballroom that smelled of hot lighting equipment and too much cologne. Seraphine Vale had just premiered the film she had spent 3 years building toward, the one everyone said would finally earn her the award she'd been circling for a decade. And for 11 minutes, the questions had been easy. Direction. Craft. The physical demands of the role. I had my tablet open, checking her car service against the festival's shifting security perimeter, half listening the way I always did, alert for the particular pitch of trouble rather than the words themselves. I'd been up since 4 that morning confirming departure windows, and I remember thinking, in the ordinary way you think about ordinary things right before your life changes, that if we left by 11, we could still make her flight connection without the studio's PR team having a public meltdown about it. That was the whole of my worry, a flight connection. I had no idea yet that within the hour, my name would be trending in 6 languages. Then a woman near the front held up her phone. "Ms. Vale, there are photographs circulating this morning of your assistant, Mara Ellis, leaving your private floor at the Carousel late last night. Can you comment?" I went very still behind the curtain. Another voice, from somewhere near the back, layered on top before Seraphine could answer. "We've also received a statement from an unnamed former colleague, alleging Ms. Ellis has been using unsuppressed omega pheromones to influence you professionally. Is that something you're aware of?" A third reporter, sensing blood, called out over the murmur that followed. "Do you intend to let her go?" I had heard versions of this ambush before, smaller ones, the kind that got smoothed over with a scheduling change, or a firm no comment. I knew the sentence Seraphine's publicist had prepared for exactly this contingency, the one we'd rehearsed twice in the car. "Ms. Ellis is a valued member of my staff. Her private life is not relevant to my work." It was clean, it was true enough. It would have ended the questions and let us both go home. Seraphine didn't say it. She looked past the reporters, past the wall of cameras, straight at the curtain where she had to know, from 8 months of knowing where I stood in every room she entered, that I was standing. Her publicist said her name under her breath, a warning. Seraphine ignored her the way she ignored almost everything when she had already decided something. "Mara is not manipulating me," she said, and her voice had none of the careful distance she used for interviews. "No one manipulated anyone. She is the woman I love." For a half second, the room made no sound at all, the particular silence of several hundred people recalibrating at once. Then it broke into noise, camera shutters going off in a continuous mechanical rain, my name being shouted from a dozen directions, a producer somewhere yelling for quiet that nobody gave her. Seraphine kept talking, something about how no Omega on her staff should be accused of biology instead of competence, just because an alpha had feelings she hadn't asked permission to have. And it was, objectively, the most protective thing anyone had ever said about me in public. It felt like the floor had opened under the curtain, and I was falling through it in silence while the room roared. Because we had kissed. We had lain in the dark trading secrets neither of us had told anyone else. I knew, with the specific clarity of a woman who organizes other people's lives for a living, that I was in love with her. But I had never said the word out loud, not to her, not to my mother, not even to myself in a mirror, and I had certainly never agreed to let 300 journalists say it for me. Seraphine had just handed the entire world something I had spent 12 years learning how to keep locked. My phone was already buzzing against my hip in a way that meant it wasn't going to stop. I didn't look at it. I didn't need to. I knew what it would say, because I had watched it happen to someone else's phone once, a lifetime ago, in a kitchen that smelled like burnt toast, while my mother stared at a screen and didn't move for 11 minutes. I unhooked the headset, set it on the folding table beside the water pitcher, and walked out through the service corridor before Seraphine had finished her answer. I don't know if she saw me go. I found out later that she had. I found out later that it was the first time in 8 months her voice had actually shaken on a stage, mid-sentence, in front of everyone. Before we return to the story, a quick note for my lovely viewers. While this YouTube series keeps things safe, my Patreon is where the real fun happens. That's where you'll find completely uncensored GL stories, much hotter exclusive videos, and bolder adventures that are just too spicy for YouTube. If you want the full, no-limits experience, and to support more of this kind of storytelling, the Patreon link is in the description below. I hadn't liked her, in the beginning. I want to be honest about that, because it matters for everything that came after. 8 months earlier, I had never intended to work for Seraphine Vale at all. I'd been placed on her production by a logistics agency that handled overflow staffing for independent and mid-budget films, the kind of job where you learn everyone's name and nobody learns yours. I'd spent 6 years doing exactly that work for small theater companies and shoestring productions, the invisible scaffolding that keeps a shoot from collapsing. Transportation, permits, catering logistics, emergency wardrobe, the 100 small disasters nobody puts in the credits. 3 assistants before me had quit working directly for Seraphine inside of 6 months, and the industry gossip blamed her temperament. The truth, once I saw it up close, was less flattering to everyone else involved. Her management staffed her like she needed 1 assistant instead of 5, and then acted surprised when the 1 assistant broke. I met her properly during a night shoot at a decommissioned railway station an hour outside the city, the kind of location that looks atmospheric in daylight scouting photos and becomes a logistical nightmare after dark. A transport company's dispatch software failed and stranded 40 crew members without shuttle service. The costume trailer's generator died with 60 period pieces hanging inside it. A supporting actress went into anaphylaxis from a catering ingredient nobody had flagged. Rain that wasn't in any forecast started destroying rented lighting equipment faster than the grips could tarp it. Somewhere in the middle of all 4 disasters happening at once, Seraphine's assistant at the time simply vanished, and nobody could find her for 2 hours. I heard later that she'd had a breakdown in a supply closet and called her sister to come get her, and I couldn't even be angry about it, because I understood exactly what that kind of night could do to a person who wasn't built to absorb chaos on command. I happen to be built that way. It's not a virtue, particularly. It's closer to a defect that turned out to be useful. I didn't ask anyone's permission. I called a car service I'd used for a different production and got 3 replacement vans rerouted within 20 minutes. I found an emergency pharmacy still open 40 minutes away and sent a driver for antihistamines and a replacement generator part. I rebuilt the next morning's call sheet from a folding table under a tent, working by phone flashlight, and I told the line producer, flatly, that if he pushed the overnight drivers past their legal hours to save the schedule, he could explain the resulting accident to whichever ambulance showed up. Seraphine watched most of this from about 15 feet away, wrapped in a production blanket, saying nothing. I assumed she was annoyed. I found out later she was doing the thing she does instead of showing emotion in front of strangers, which is calculate. Our first real conversation happened an hour before dawn, when the line producer went over my head and told Seraphine that delaying the following day's shoot to let the exhausted crew sleep would cost the production close to $300,000. Seraphine turned to me, not to him, and asked whether that was actually true. "It's true," I said. "It's also not the number that matters. If someone falls asleep behind the wheel because your schedule was more important than 8 hours of rest, you can go ahead and explain the budget to the ambulance." She didn't smile. She didn't argue either. She simply nodded once, told the producer to push the call by 4 hours, and walked off toward the wardrobe trailer to help 2 exhausted production assistants carry racks of soaked costumes to a dry truck, hauling armfuls of period silk through mud in shoes that cost more than my monthly rent. She knew both of their names. She thanked them by name. I stood there recalibrating everything the trade press had ever printed about her. The next morning, she offered me the job directly, bypassing the agency and the line producer both. I said no. She raised the number. I said no again, and when she asked, evenly, what the real objection was, I gave her the honest answer instead of a professional one. "I don't want my life becoming part of yours," I told her. "I've watched what that does to people who never agreed to it." She didn't ask what I meant. She promised, without needing the story, that my privacy would stay mine, and she asked what that would require in practice. I told her, no photographs of me distributed by her team, no social media presence built around me, No fabricated dating rumors used to redirect attention from her real ones. No disclosure of my designation without my say-so. No entering my hotel room without being asked first. No contact on my days off unless someone's life depended on it. And no treatment, ever, that assumed an alpha's paycheck bought an omega's deference. She agreed to all of it without negotiating a single term, which surprised me more than the salary did. I took the job for 6 months, long enough to clear my remaining debt and move my mother into an apartment with a door that actually locked. For the first several weeks, she followed every condition I'd named with something close to obsessive precision, and I started, against my better judgment, to trust her. The work put me inside her life in ways the public never sees, and that, more than anything, was how it happened. At 4 a.m. on a freezing exterior set, I started draping a heated coat over her shoulders between takes without being asked, and pretended not to notice when she leaned into it, a half-second longer than the cold required, drawing in a slow breath like she was trying to place something. In a cramped production van rattling through countryside before sunrise, we argued for 40 minutes about whether her character's motivation in a rewritten scene made sense, both of us balancing bad coffee on our knees, and I realized somewhere around minute 30 that I was enjoying myself more than I had any professional right to. In a 5-star hotel suite with a catered dinner cooling untouched on a cart, she ignored it entirely and ate my instant noodles standing at the counter, declaring them superior with the flat conviction of someone who had eaten a great many disappointing $1,000 meals. During a 12-hour airport delay in a VIP lounge that looked like a furniture catalog, she kicked off her shoes, sat cross-legged on the carpet with her back against a leather sofa, and looked so plainly, bodily exhausted that I understood, for the first time, how much of her public composure was a costume she put on every morning along with everything else. We got locked, once, inside a costume archive in a historic mansion being used as a location, after the last crew member left for the night without realizing we were still inside. There was no drama to it, no manufactured tension, just 2 women sitting on the floor between racks of century-old fabric, waiting for a night guard to notice the interior lights, talking honestly in the dark because there was nothing else to do. She told me she hadn't eaten a meal alone with someone who wasn't paid to be there in longer than she wanted to admit. I told her that was the loneliest thing I'd heard all week, and she laughed. Actually laughed, a sound I didn't know she had in her. At an awards rehearsal, thick with competing alpha cologne and pheromone-heavy perfume, I watched her jaw tighten and her breathing shorten, in a room I recognized, from my own body, as sensory overload, and I got her out through a service door, to an empty, scent-neutral dressing room, before anyone else clocked what was happening. She didn't thank me in words. She sat down hard in the chair and closed her eyes and let me stand guard at the door, and that felt like more trust than words would have carried. On a beach at sunrise for an early call, with no one watching but the crew, she laughed at something genuinely stupid I said about the catering truck, and I saw, for the first time, what her face did when nothing was being photographed. In a foreign city late at night, wearing a baseball cap and glasses that fooled absolutely no one, but somehow worked anyway, she became ridiculous with delight over a 24-hour grocery store, filling a basket with 3 kinds of instant noodles and reading ingredient labels aloud like poetry. When an older stunt performer she'd worked with for a decade got hurt on set, she sat in a hospital waiting room for 6 hours, despite her publicist begging her to attend a scheduled event instead, and she didn't so much as check her phone the entire time. In a small rehearsal room, running lines for a scene about a mother who never came back, her voice cracked on a line that wasn't supposed to crack, and she looked so unguarded afterward that I had to look away to keep from reaching for her. When our hotel lost service during a location shoot and left us with 3 days of unwashed clothes, she insisted on learning to operate the laundromat's ancient machines herself instead of letting me handle it, and got genuinely, stubbornly furious at a coin slot that ate her quarters. There was an awards rehearsal, weeks into that same stretch, where I watched a well-known alpha co-star lean into her space at the craft table, his hand finding her shoulder with a familiarity that hadn't been earned, and I felt something sharp and unhelpful move through me before I could talk myself out of it. I hated how much it bothered me. I busied myself with a clipboard I didn't need, and told myself it was none of my business who touched her. And I mostly believed it, right up until Seraphine caught my eye over his shoulder and stepped back from him with a small, deliberate motion that had nothing to do with rehearsal blocking. She didn't say anything about it afterward. She didn't have to. I understood, watching her do it, that she'd noticed exactly what I was feeling and chosen, quietly, to answer it without ever making either of us say the word jealousy out loud. There was a night, much later in that same production, when a scene called for her character to break down completely on camera, grief written into every line of dialogue, and Seraphine gave a take so raw the whole crew went silent afterward, instead of calling cut on schedule. She walked straight off set into the dark beyond the lights without a word to anyone, and I found her 20 feet past the last generator, sitting on an overturned equipment case with her face in her hands, not performing anything anymore. I didn't say a word either. I sat down next to her and put my hand flat between her shoulder blades, the way you'd steady someone standing too close to an edge, and after a while her breathing evened out, and she leaned into me instead of away, which told me more about where we stood than any conversation could have. She started making small exceptions to a life that had been rigid for years. She ate breakfast only because I reminded her to, and eventually only when I was in the room. She left her dressing room door unlocked when she knew I was nearby. She learned that I took my tea black in the morning, and with honey after sundown, and never asked twice. She remembered my mother's birthday from a single offhand mention and had flowers sent that she made sure never carried her name on the card. She stopped letting producers schedule me through mealtimes like I didn't need to eat. I learned her rhythms just as completely, without either of us naming what we were doing. I knew when she needed silence instead of conversation, which interviewers made her anxious before we'd even walked in, that she hated being approached from behind without warning, that she slept badly for 2 nights after filming anything emotionally brutal. Neither of us called it love. It would have required admitting we were paying that kind of attention to each other, and for a long time it was easier to let it live in the unnamed space between competence and care. Biology complicated things in ways that stayed mostly beneath the surface. The industry treated alpha and omega pairings as a marketing category, manufactured for headlines more often than not, and omega actors were routinely accused of scenting their way into roles they'd earned by working harder than anyone gave them credit for. Seraphine had spent years wearing professional scent neutralizers on set, after an early studio decided her overwhelming alpha presence made good copy, and she was allergic, by now, to anything that reduced her to her biology. I used a light suppressant at work for the same reason, in reverse. She never once treated my scent as an invitation, even when my suppressant wore thin toward the end of a long day, and she had to know exactly what she was standing near. She kept distance instead, deliberately, every time. During one brutal production week, I started sliding into a preheat earlier than I'd planned for, embarrassed and determined to keep working through it the way I always had. I told myself it was manageable. I told myself I'd handled worse with less warning. Seraphine noticed before I said a word, watching me across a crowded set with an attentiveness that had nothing to do with scheduling, the particular focus of someone who had learned to read me the way she read a script, for what wasn't being said out loud. She found a reason to walk with me to craft services and asked, low enough that no one else could hear it, whether I was all right. I told her I was fine, which was a lie transparent enough that she simply waited, patient, until I gave her the real answer. She didn't take charge of the situation the way half the alphas I'd worked for over the years would have, assuming authority they hadn't been given. She asked what I wanted. I told her I needed 2 days away from set, and something eased visibly in her shoulders, relief at being asked rather than having to guess. She rearranged the entire production schedule around my absence, without giving anyone a real reason, absorbing 2 producers' confusion without explanation, and she did not come near my hotel room while I was gone. Not once, though I knew from the way she moved around me afterward that staying away had cost her something. Instead, I found a bag outside my door that evening, food from a place I'd mentioned liking once in passing, weeks earlier, medication from my own approved pharmacy that she must have called ahead to verify, and a stack of the cheapest, most ridiculous mystery paperbacks I'd ever seen, spines already cracked like she'd bought them secondhand on purpose. No note attached beyond 4 words on a sticky tab pressed to the top book. You said boredom makes you reckless. I laughed out loud, alone in a hotel hallway, in a way that surprised me enough that I had to sit down on the floor with my back against the door. I learned afterward, from a member of her security detail who mentioned it without thinking twice, that she'd slept on the far side of that floor for 2 nights, in a suite she didn't normally use, unwilling to trust her own instincts near enough to risk creating pressure I hadn't asked for. It did more to convince me of something real between us than any of the things an alpha is supposed to do to prove devotion. Restraint, it turned out, was a language I understood far better than declarations. I understood her coldness better once I learned where it came from. At 24, she'd been quietly, seriously involved with another actress, the first real relationship of her adult life, the kind that felt at the time like it might last forever. When the studio found out, the other woman sold intimate messages and photographs to a magazine in exchange for a career opportunity Seraphine only learned about afterward, reading about her own private life over breakfast in a paper someone had left folded open to the page on purpose. Her designation cycle, her medical history, her family, all of it became public entertainment inside a week. Reporters camped outside her parents' house. A late-night host made a joke about her heat schedule that got repeated for months. She told me she stopped being able to tell, for a long stretch afterward, whether anyone in a room with her wanted Seraphine or wanted access. Her management solution was to install her in a fabricated relationship with a well-known male alpha actor for nearly 2 years. Nothing real ever happening between them, purely to stabilize a brand that had briefly slipped out of the studio's control. She described it to me flatly, without self-pity, as the loneliest arrangement of her life, 2 people performing intimacy for cameras and going home to separate apartments every single night. She hadn't publicly dated anyone since, not really. Not in a way that survived contact with her own life. She told me this on a night I won't forget, sitting on the floor of that costume archive with her knees drawn up like she was bracing for something, and I understood, finally, why she'd built a decade of practiced distance around herself, why stillness had become the only safety she trusted. I was, she said later, the first true thing she'd voluntarily let herself want in all that time. That history is why, when the moment came, she believed telling the truth in public was an act of protection instead of a violation. She had spent 10 years learning that the press could turn love into merchandise. She hadn't yet learned that something being true didn't automatically make it hers to give away. The turn between us happened on a stretch of coast 3 hours from the city, where a storm delayed filming for 4 straight days and stranded the whole cast in a small historic hotel instead of the resort the studio had originally booked. For the first time in months, neither of us had a schedule. We walked the empty town in the rain, sharing one umbrella that did a mediocre job of covering either of us, past shuttered shops and a fisherman's chapel with its doors propped open against the weather. We ate at a tiny restaurant with 4 tables and a menu written on a chalkboard, where the owner recognized her instantly, said nothing beyond a warm greeting, and asked for no photograph. And I watched Seraphine relax into her chair in a way I'd never seen her relax anywhere with cameras nearby, because there weren't any, and because for once no one in the room needed anything from her. She ordered for both of us in halting, badly accented local dialect that made the owner laugh outright, and ate everything on her plate with an appetite I rarely saw at catered events. And somewhere between the second course and the rain finally slowing outside the window, I realized I was watching a version of her almost no one else alive had ever been allowed to see. That evening we sat under the overhang of an old covered balcony while the storm worked itself out over the water, 2 glasses of cheap local wine going warm on the railing between us, and the conversation went somewhere neither of us had planned. I told her about my mother. I told her about being 16 and watching photographers set up lawn chairs outside our house after a tabloid discovered my mother's relationship with a prominent alpha politician, about my mother losing her job inside a month, about strangers online discussing things that belonged to no one but us. I told her why cameras still made my skin crawl a decade later, why I thought being known by strangers meant surrendering pieces of yourself you never agreed to give up. She listened without trying to fix it, which I'd come to understand was the rarest thing she knew how to offer. Then she said quietly, I will never make you public without asking you first. I believed her completely. I would think about that sentence many times in the months that followed, for reasons that had nothing to do with doubt at the time. She told me pieces of her own history in return that night. The betrayal at 24, the manufactured relationship that followed, and I understood, hearing it in her voice instead of second-hand from an industry rumor, that her coldness had always been architecture, built to survive something specific, not an absence of feeling. We came close to kissing that night, her hand finding the side of my face with a carefulness that made my breath go shallow, close enough that I could smell bergamot and rain-cooled stone, and something underneath both that I'd never let myself name as want before that exact second. She stopped herself an inch away and said, plainly, that I worked for her, that the imbalance mattered even if neither of us wanted it to in that moment. That's a very inconvenient time to discover ethics, I told her, and she laughed, a real laugh that cracked something open in her face. But she didn't cross the line, drawing back instead with visible effort. I've thought about very little else for months, she admitted, which was the closest either of us had come to saying anything out loud. She didn't cross the line, and something in me trusted her more for stopping than I would have trusted her for continuing, because it told me the promise she'd made about my privacy a few hours earlier wasn't the only thing she took seriously. She didn't let the attraction sit unresolved for long. Within weeks, she offered me an independent production management position, reporting directly to the studio instead of to her personally, better title, better salary, real autonomy, and my first reaction was anger, certain she was maneuvering me out of her life, because wanting me had become inconvenient to manage alongside a professional relationship. I told her as much, sharper than I meant to. She corrected me before I could finish the accusation, standing very still, the way she did when something mattered to her too much to perform. I want to kiss you, she said, and I can't ask while your paycheck depends on whether I'm pleased with you. It was, and remains, one of the most honest things anyone has ever said to me. I took the new position because it was genuinely good for my career on its own merits, not because it cleared a path to her bed, and I told her exactly that, and she nodded like she'd expected nothing less. We kept a deliberate distance through the weeks it took to make the transition official, professional in every meeting, careful never to be alone together longer than a hallway required, which only sharpened everything neither of us was saying out loud. Once I was no longer her employee, she asked me to dinner somewhere that wasn't a private dining room, reserved by a publicist, and vetted by 3 layers of security. I chose a small bookstore cafe I liked, tucked behind a philosophy section nobody browsed anymore, and she arrived 25 minutes early, visibly nervous in a way the tabloids would never have believed possible, wearing a coat that was trying too hard not to look expensive. We talked for 3 hours about nothing important and everything that mattered, and she walked me home afterward at a pace slow enough that I understood she didn't want the night to end any more than I did. That night, in my apartment, I was the one who closed the distance between us. She asked, once, quietly, her forehead nearly touching mine, whether I was sure. I made certain there was no question left in the room. What followed was slow and unhurried, and entirely ours. Nothing performed, nothing photographed. Just 2 women finally allowing themselves the thing they'd been circling for months. The morning after felt warm and faintly ridiculous rather than cinematic. Mostly because a woman capable of memorizing 80 pages of dialogue in an afternoon turned out to be catastrophic at making pancakes, flour on the counter, batter smoking faintly in a pan she'd set too hot, and I laughed at her, unguarded, until she threatened, with mock severity, to make me finish the batch myself, while she supervised from a safe distance. For weeks after that, we existed in a space with no name attached to it. We kissed in kitchens and slept curled together in hotel rooms and shared meals that weren't catered by anyone. I stayed in her suite some nights. She came to my modest apartment on others, and seemed to like it there more than she liked her own, folding herself onto my second-hand couch like it was the most comfortable piece of furniture she'd ever encountered. I hesitated to call any of it a relationship out loud, not because I doubted what I felt, but because I was afraid of what happened to things the moment they became real to other people. There was a night, maybe 3 weeks in, when a colleague from the production office ran into us leaving a restaurant together and asked, lightly, curiously, whether we were seeing each other. I said we were friends who worked well together, fast and automatic, and I felt Seraphine go quiet beside me for the rest of the walk home. Not angry, just quiet in a way that told me the word had landed somewhere it shouldn't have. She didn't bring it up that night. She brought it up 2 days later, carefully, asking whether I was embarrassed by her. I told her no, truthfully, and struggled to explain that the fear wasn't about her at all. It was about what the word relationship did once other people got hold of it, how quickly a private thing became a headline once it had a name attached. Seraphine accepted my hesitation on the surface, while something quieter ate at her underneath it. A suspicion, half a decade in the making, that anyone who wanted her privately might still be ashamed to be seen with her publicly. I wasn't ashamed. I was frightened in a way I hadn't yet found the words to explain to her fully, and the gap between those two things grew slowly enough that neither of us noticed it widening until it was already a problem neither of us had named. The attention found me before either of us was ready. A gossip account identified me by name as Seraphine's former assistant, and for a while the speculation stayed relatively harmless. Then it curdled. A tabloid ran a piece suggesting I'd used my designation deliberately to gain access to her, and within days, someone had dug up my mother's old scandal and printed our names side by side like a pattern instead of a coincidence. Photographers started waiting outside my apartment building, and I was sick in my own bathroom the first morning I saw one crouched by the entrance with a long lens. Seraphine wanted to deploy private security around me immediately. I refused a constant escort, and we settled on discreet building protection and a direct line to her security team instead, a compromise that let me keep some sense of my own movement through the world. Her studio saw an opening in all of it. Her publicity team floated the idea, gently at first, that confirming the relationship publicly might actually help her numbers with certain audiences. Seraphine told them, in a meeting I wasn't in but heard about within the hour, that I was not marketing material, and I felt something settle in my chest when I found out, a kind of love that didn't need to be witnessed to be real. At the same time, the studio pressured her to appear publicly with her male co-star, to redirect the growing rumors, and she refused that too, at real cost. She lost a luxury sponsorship worth more than I would earn in a decade, and she didn't tell me. I learned about it weeks later from someone else entirely, and it told me more about what she was willing to lose for me than anything she could have said directly. Most of the pressure, in the end, had a name and a face. Victoria Sloan, 48, the beta who had managed Seraphine's career since she was 18, and genuinely believed she loved her like family. Victoria wasn't cruel. That was what made her dangerous. She'd watched an earlier scandal nearly destroy Seraphine, and had spent 15 years constructing a brand strong enough to survive anything, and she saw me, not unfairly, as the first variable in a decade she couldn't control. She found me alone once, in a quiet hallway between meetings, expensive heels clicking to a stop a careful distance from me, and studied me for a long moment before she spoke. "You think privacy is something Seraphine can give you," she said, not unkindly. "It isn't. Privacy around her is borrowed time, and the loan always comes due." She told me she'd watched 2 of Seraphine's previous relationships end in exactly this hallway, in exactly this conversation, and that she wasn't interested in watching a third. She offered me a generous severance and a position with a production company abroad, phrased as an opportunity rather than a threat, though we both understood what it actually was. I said no. She didn't threaten me, not directly, not in any way I could have repeated to Seraphine and expected her to act on. She simply told me, with the calm certainty of someone who had already watched this exact story happen once before, that eventually, Seraphine would be made to choose between my privacy and her own career, and that when that day came, I should already know which one the industry would ask her to protect. I told her I wasn't asking Seraphine to choose anything. Victoria smiled like she'd heard that sentence before too, from someone else, a long time ago, and it hadn't turned out to be true then either. The leak came just before the festival. Photographs surfaced showing me leaving Seraphine's private floor late at night, technically explicable, visually damning enough to feed exactly the story the tabloids wanted. Victoria hadn't produced them, but she knew who had before Seraphine did, and she sat on that knowledge for 2 days, quietly hoping the scandal would do the work of ending things that she hadn't been able to do herself through severance offers and careful warnings in quiet hallways. A former production employee, paid or flattered into it, gave an anonymous quote claiming I'd deliberately stopped suppressing my scent around Seraphine to gain influence over her, and the accusation metastasized fast, turning me overnight into a caricature of a manipulative Omega in 3 different publications, my competence rewritten as calculation, my career rewritten as a long con. A production company I'd been in quiet talks with for months withdrew without explanation the day the story broke. Journalists started calling my mother's landline at odd hours, and she stopped answering it, and I hated, more than anything else in those days, that her quiet, rebuilt life was being pulled backward into the exact kind of exposure she'd spent a decade escaping. By the morning of the press conference, I was holding myself together with tape and habit, running Seraphine's schedule on autopilot, because it was easier than sitting with what was happening to my own name. Seraphine, watching the accusations pile up in real time from behind a curtain of her own, decided that silence had already cost me too much, and I understood, later, that she'd made that decision out of love, and out of 10 years of watching silence fail to protect anyone, without stopping to ask whether I wanted this particular kind of protection at all. I could see her, from where I stood, catch the moment the questions turned dangerous. Victoria was at her elbow, low and urgent, pushing the prepared line. I signaled toward the curtain, willing Seraphine to use it, to give the safe, careful answer we'd rehearsed. She looked at me instead, and must have read fear on my face and understood it, wrongly, as fear of the accusation, rather than fear of what the truth, spoken aloud in that room, would cost me. She thought telling the whole truth would protect me completely. She didn't understand, in that instant, that it would also take something from me I hadn't offered. When she found me afterward, I was already folding my things into a bag in the tiny room behind the stage, hands moving on their own, the way they do when the rest of me has gone somewhere else. She said my name. I didn't stop packing. "You defended me from strangers," I told her, "by handing those same strangers the one thing I begged you to keep from them." "They called you predatory," she said. "I wasn't going to let that stand. You could have defended me without announcing that you love me to 400 journalists." I told them the truth. Truth still needs consent when it belongs to 2 people, I said, and watched something break open behind her eyes, the exact moment she understood what she'd actually done on that rainy balcony months earlier, the promise she'd made, and then broken in front of the entire world. "I was trying to protect you," she said, and her voice had lost all the composure it carried on stages, in interviews, in every room designed to look at her. "I couldn't stand there and let them call you a predator." "I know that," I said, and I did, which somehow made it worse instead of better. "I know you meant it as love, but you didn't ask me. You decided what I could survive without checking whether I agreed, and that's the same thing every person in my life who ever hurt my family did. They all thought they knew better than we did, what our own story should look like in public." She flinched at that, visibly, and reached for me, and I stepped back before her hand landed, not out of anger exactly, more out of a need to keep myself upright while everything I'd spent a decade building around my own privacy came apart in a hotel service corridor. She apologized immediately, twice, and I believed that she meant it both times, and it still wasn't enough to undo what had already happened to my name, my history, my mother's old wound, all of it now permanently attached to a headline I hadn't agreed to be part of. I left the festival with security of my own choosing, alone, and I didn't look back to see whether she watched me go a second time. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my adult life. Reporters found school photographs I didn't know still existed. My professional biography got picked apart online by strangers who felt entitled to know every detail of how I'd ended up in this story. People speculated, with a casual cruelty that still surprises me when I think about it, on the specifics of my heat cycle, as though my body were public infrastructure. Brands I'd never heard of offered me sponsorships. Strangers sent gifts and strangers sent hate mail, sometimes in the same week, sometimes to the same address. I stopped sleeping properly. Eventually, I packed a bag and went to stay with my mother in the quiet town she'd rebuilt her life in. The first time in years I'd needed her, more than she needed me. We talked, really talked, for the first time about what had happened to her when I was 16. I'd always assumed she regretted the relationship that cost her everything, that if she could reach backward through time, she would have made herself smaller, quieter, more careful, invisible enough to never have been found. She told me, sitting at her kitchen table with 2 cups of tea going cold between us, that she'd never regretted loving the man, only the years she'd spent afterward letting shame convince her that the scandal was the whole of her story instead of one chapter in it. I let them decide what that year meant, she said. I let the headlines write the ending, and I spent a decade agreeing with them instead of writing my own. She reached across the table and took my hand, the way she used to when I was small and frightened of something ordinary. A thunderstorm, a dog, the dark. You get to decide what this means, Mara, not the papers. Not even her, no matter how much she loves you, you. She didn't tell me to forgive Seraphine. She was careful, deliberately, not to make that decision for me. And I loved her for the restraint, even as some smaller part of me wished she'd just tell me what to do so I wouldn't have to carry the weight of choosing. But she told me that hiding forever was its own way of letting strangers keep control of you, and I turned that over for a long time after I went to bed that night, staring at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom like it might have an answer written on it somewhere. Seraphine, for her part, did none of the things a story like this usually promises. No surprise visit at my mother's door, no private jet landing somewhere dramatic, no flood of flowers meant to overwhelm rather than communicate. No attempt to buy back what she'd broken. I had asked, in the only conversation we'd had since the festival, for space, and she gave it to me completely, which was its own kind of statement. She made her own accounting in public instead. A second statement, carefully worded, revealed nothing new about me and said everything that mattered about her. She'd spoken about a private relationship without the other person's permission. Her feelings had been real. Her decision had still been wrong. She asked the press, plainly, to leave me and my family alone. She didn't ask, anywhere in it, for my forgiveness, and that restraint told me more than a public plea ever could have. Privately, she fired Victoria the week after learning Victoria had sat on the leak for 2 days, hoping it would end things on its own. I heard about the confrontation secondhand, from someone who'd been in the building, and it apparently left them both shaken, because whatever else was true, Victoria had helped raise her, professionally and otherwise, had sat with a 19-year-old Seraphine through the earlier scandal, and taught her how to survive it, and severing that wasn't clean for either of them. Victoria told her she'd destroyed 15 years of careful work, built to protect exactly this kind of collapse. Seraphine told her that maybe a life that required hiding every real feeling had already cost more than it was worth, that she was tired of measuring love in terms of brand risk. Victoria left the meeting, and left the company, without another word. She didn't quit acting. She loved the work too much for that, and I never wanted her to give it up, whatever else changed between us. She changed management companies instead, choosing a smaller firm with a reputation for staying out of its clients' personal lives, and started keeping a hand on her own image that she'd never bothered to keep before, reading contracts herself, instead of signing what was placed in front of her. I rebuilt something too, on my own terms. The production company that had quietly dropped me came back once public sympathy shifted, offering to restore the position as though nothing had happened, as though I hadn't spent 3 weeks unable to check my own email without shaking. I turned them down, because a company willing to abandon me that easily under pressure wasn't one I trusted to protect anyone else the next time something went wrong. Instead, I took a role helping build an independent organization focused on protecting assistants, junior crew, and Omega workers from designation-based harassment and the kind of exploitative confidentiality contracts that had nearly swallowed my own name entirely. The work was unglamorous and mostly invisible, drafting model clauses, meeting quietly with people who'd lived through smaller, uncelebrated versions of what had happened to me, building something that would outlast a single news cycle. I gave one statement through an attorney, 3 careful paragraphs that said exactly as much as I wanted said, and not one word more, and I refused every interview request after that, no matter how sympathetic the outlet or how large the platform. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was mine, chosen and controlled by me from the first day, and it taught me that being seen didn't automatically mean being owned, provided I was the one deciding the terms. Several weeks into that quieter life, a letter arrived, handwritten, unannounced, and mercifully short. No return address, just my name, in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere after 8 months of reading her notes on call sheets. Seraphine hadn't tried to persuade me of anything. She'd simply named what she'd done, plainly, without excuses folded into the apology the way apologies so often carry their own defense. She wrote that she had broken a direct promise made on a rainy balcony, that she had mistaken protection for permission, and had acted out of fear instead of trust, the same fear that had shaped her whole adult life until she'd let it make a decision that wasn't hers alone to make. That she had made my sexuality and my relationship status global property without asking, and that being in love with me hadn't given her the right to do that, whatever she'd told herself in the moment. She wrote that she understood the difference now in a way she clearly hadn't at the time, and that understanding it after the fact didn't undo the cost of learning it late. She told me she still loved me, and that love wasn't a question I owed her an answer to, that she would not treat my silence as a wound she was entitled to have healed. She said she wouldn't contact me again unless I chose to let her, and true to her word, she didn't. I read the letter twice, then a third time, sitting on the edge of my mother's guest bed with my knees pulled up, and folded it carefully into the drawer of the nightstand instead of answering right away, because I still didn't know what I wanted to say, and I trusted, finally, that she would actually wait for me to find out. The film we'd built together, months earlier, received a major nomination not long after that, and my own credit as associate production coordinator earned me an invitation the studio clearly assumed I'd decline. I considered it. Then I realized that avoiding every space connected to Seraphine for the rest of my life would mean rebuilding my entire career around the shape of my absence from hers, and I decided I wasn't willing to organize my life around anyone that way, including her. I went. Not as her guest. I walked the carpet with members of the production team, wearing something I'd chosen for myself, and declined every question a reporter tried to angle toward her. Inside the theater, I felt her find me across the room before I saw her do it. She didn't approach. She waited, and something about that restraint mattered more than any grand gesture could have. After the film won, I found her alone in a service corridor behind the stage instead of at the celebration everyone expected her to be enjoying, still holding the small trophy loosely in one hand like she'd forgotten it was there. No cameras, no audience, just fluorescent light and the muffled sound of the party through a closed door. She looked up when she heard my footsteps and went very still, the way she did when something mattered too much to trust her own reaction to it. She asked, simply, whether I was doing all right. I told her I was learning how to be, which was the truest answer I had. She asked about the organization, and I found myself telling her more than I meant to, about the contracts, about the people I'd met who'd lived through smaller versions of what happened to me, and she listened the way she always had, completely, like nothing else in the building existed. She apologized again, quietly, and I told her, gently, that she didn't need to keep doing that if she understood what had actually changed, because an apology repeated past the point of being heard starts to become about the person giving it, instead of the person receiving it. I used to think loving someone meant protecting everything I could reach, she said. I think now it sometimes means standing still while they decide whether to come back. I didn't kiss her that night. I asked her to have coffee with me the following week instead, and the smallness of that invitation felt, to both of us, enormous. We started again from somewhere closer to the beginning. I wasn't her employee anymore, which changed the shape of everything between us, and neither of us tried to rush back to where we'd left off, both of us aware that the version of trust we'd had before had proven itself insufficient. We met in places I chose the visibility of: a quiet bookstore, a restaurant with no interest in celebrity, my apartment, her kitchen, a walking path at sunrise where nobody recognized either of us under baseball caps and old jackets. She always asked before inviting me anywhere public, phrasing it as a genuine question rather than an assumption. And she accepted my no without flinching or making me pay for it later in small withdrawals of warmth the way some people do. Slowly, I learned I could say yes sometimes too, and still keep the parts of myself I needed to keep. That saying yes once didn't obligate me to say yes again. There was an early dinner with two of her closest friends from the industry, people who'd known her since before any of the fame, and I watched her introduce me simply as Mara, no explanation attached, no performance of what I was to her, and let the two of them draw their own conclusions at their own pace. It felt like the opposite of a press conference, and I loved her a little more for understanding the difference now. One night, she showed up at my apartment after an exhausting shoot and fell asleep sitting upright on my couch with a script still open in her lap, exhaustion written into every line of her. I eased it out of her hands, and she woke instantly, the way people do when trust hasn't fully rebuilt yet, eyes snapping open with something close to alarm before she recognized where she was. "Am I allowed to stay?" she asked, quietly, and the question held more in it than the words alone carried. I told her yes, and understood, hearing myself say it, how far we'd both come from where we started, and how much more deliberately we were both choosing to be there this time. I asked her, eventually, to go back with me to the coastal town where we'd almost kissed the first time. She didn't ask why, just booked 2 rooms this time instead of 1, which told me she understood exactly what kind of trip this was meant to be. The same balcony was there, weathered a little more by another year of salt air, the same view of the water, clear skies this time instead of storm. The little restaurant with the chalkboard menu still open down the hill. We ate at the same table. The owner remembered her, and didn't ask a single question about the year in between. That evening, on the balcony, I told her I'd spent years believing privacy meant keeping every door in my life bolted shut, and that I understood now it actually meant choosing which doors opened and who got handed the key. Then I told her the condition that mattered most, the one I'd rehearsed on the drive down until I could say it without my voice shaking. If I open one for you again, you don't get to open the rest of them for me. She promised, without hesitation, and I believed her more completely than I had the first time, because this promise came after she'd already broken one and lived with the full cost of it, and a promise made by someone who has learned what breaking it does is worth more than one made in comfortable ignorance. I asked whether she loved me. She said yes, immediately. No performance in it at all. I asked whether she could love me privately, even if the world never learned another detail about us, if this stayed ours alone for the rest of our lives. She said yes to that too, and meant it in a way I could feel settle into my chest, like something finally landing after months of hovering. I kissed her then, and it carried a weight the first one hadn't, because this one was a choice made twice, deliberately, with both of us knowing exactly what it could cost and choosing it anyway. Months later, she won the most significant award of her career, the one every trade paper had spent a decade predicting for her, the one that would finally close the gap between what she'd survived and what she'd earned. Before the ceremony, she asked whether I wanted to attend, and I said yes. She asked whether I wanted to enter separately, and I said yes to that too, and she accepted it without argument, without so much as a flicker of the old insecurity that would once have read the request as rejection. I arrived on my own, in a dress I'd chosen without consulting anyone, and sat with the people I'd worked alongside rather than beside her, 3 rows back, close enough to see her hands shake slightly when they called her name. When she won, her acceptance speech thanked the director, the cast, the crew who'd carried that impossible night shoot at the railway station, her family, and near the end, she spoke, carefully, about learning that telling the truth also meant respecting the people who lived inside that truth alongside her, that a story wasn't fully hers to tell alone when someone else's life was woven through it. She didn't say my name. She didn't look for me in the crowd for approval, didn't let her eyes search the rows the way an older version of her might have. She kept the promise, completely, in front of everyone in that theater, and everyone watching from home who had spent the last year assuming they knew exactly how this story would end. It moved me more than any declaration could have. Afterward, surrounded by reporters in the press line, someone finally asked her directly whether I was still the woman she loved. The question hung there, exactly the kind of question that had detonated both our lives once already. She paused, longer than she needed to, and then she said evenly, "That's something Mara gets to answer for herself." It was the clearest evidence yet of everything she'd learned in the year since that first press conference. I was standing close enough, just past the rope line, to hear it clearly, and for the first time being protected by her didn't feel like being hidden, or claimed, or spoken for. It felt like being handed a choice, freely, with no expectation attached to how I used it. So I made one. I walked through the wall of photographers toward her, past security who didn't know what to do with me, and I watched genuine shock cross her face before anything else did, before the composure she wore for cameras had a chance to reassemble itself. When I reached her, a reporter asked whether I wanted to respond to what she'd just said. I didn't give a speech. I took her hand where every camera in the room could see it, feeling the whole room's attention swing toward us like weather changing, and I said, "She's the woman I love too." The first declaration had belonged only to her, taken from me on a stage I hadn't chosen. This one was mine, made on my own timeline, in my own words, standing on my own 2 feet, and that difference was the whole of what we'd spent the last year learning, together and separately, the hard way. Our life since then has stayed mostly, deliberately ordinary. Our relationship is public now, in the sense that anyone can know it exists, but its actual details remain ours to keep. I go to some premieres and skip others, and she comes to my organization's events sometimes without ever turning them into press opportunities for herself, standing at the back of the room instead of the front, refusing every photographer who tries to make the evening about her instead of the work. We've kept our professional identities separate on purpose. I held on to my own apartment for a long while before I finally chose, on my own schedule and not because anyone was waiting for me to decide, to move into a home we built together, rather than one she simply handed me, choosing furniture together in stores that made her visibly uncomfortable with how ordinary they were, which I found endlessly funny. It's imperfect in the way lived-in places are. My label maker has found its way onto her chaotic script shelves, alphabetized against her wishes. She still drapes award-worthy dresses over the backs of chairs despite owning a closet large enough to prevent it, and she still occasionally makes pancakes that verge on structurally unsound, though she's gotten considerably better with practice, and takes it far too seriously as a personal accomplishment. She steals my mystery novels before I finish them, and leaves them face down on whatever surface is nearest, spine cracking in ways that used to bother me and now just sound like her. I keep an emergency travel bag ready by the door, for whenever a shoot calls her away with no notice, because some habits from those first 8 months never fully left either of us, and because some kinds of readiness turned out to be love, rather than anxiety after all. Late one night, not long ago, we sat together after she'd come home from a long day of filming, still smelling faintly of the cold soundstage air, the television playing entertainment news in another room with our names mentioned somewhere in the segment, some anniversary piece recapping a story that no longer felt like it belonged to strangers. I reached over and turned it off without really thinking about it, the remote finding my hand before the thought had finished forming. She asked whether I was tired of hearing us discussed like that, watching me with the careful attention she still gave to questions that mattered. I told her I was simply more interested in the woman sitting beside me, tea going cold in her hands, hair still damp from a shower, than in the version of her that strangers thought they knew from magazine covers and old headlines. She considered that for a moment, the way she considers most things, turning it over before she let herself believe it. She asked whether I regretted walking toward those cameras the night she won her award, whether some part of me wished I'd let the moment stay hers alone, the way the first one had been. I looked around at the quiet, unglamorous, entirely real life we'd built out of everything that had nearly broken us, at the label maker on her shelves, and the dress still draped over the reading chair, and the paperback with the cracked spine lying face down on the coffee table, and told her no, I didn't regret it at all. But I reminded her, because some things are worth saying more than once, that if she ever decided to announce something that personal at a press conference again, without asking me first, I would personally cancel every interview on her calendar for a month out of pure spite, and I would enjoy every minute of doing it. She laughed, the real laugh, low and unguarded, the one almost no one else in her entire public life had ever been allowed to hear, and told me she wouldn't dream of testing it, that she'd learned that particular lesson thoroughly enough for one lifetime. Outside, the city went on being loud and photographed and hungry for headlines the way it always would, the way it probably always will. Inside, with the television off and her hand finding mine on the couch the way it did most nights now, none of that reached us at all. The world knew we loved each other. It had never once owned what that actually meant, and it never would, because we had both finally learned, the hard way and then the gentle way, exactly which doors were ours to keep, and which ones we chose, together, to leave open.